Hello, class. This is your first lesson on content for Catching Dreams. And remember, our content is linked to the human stages of development. Last time we did conception, which was -9 to 0. And today we are going to be talking about birth and infancy. So, our information core for this unit, the content is birth and infancy. The culture that we are studying are some of the Native American cultures. You are going to be making dream catchers. The time period we are looking at specifically is 1850 to 1900, which was a critical time during the Western expansion for Native Americans. We are talking about the Great Plains, and the reason why, as we'll get into later, is spiritual protection. And the process is a weaving process that is known as netting. So, some essential questions for this lesson. What are the ages of birth and infancy? What are the physical, psychological, and social characteristics of babies? How do you take care of babies? What is mortality rate? Who had the highest infant mortality rate during the time from 1850 to 1900 and why? And how has giving birth changed from then until now? So it's a lot to cover. And the image that you're looking at is a newborn. So tiny. So the infant, the age that we go with for the infant or the baby is 0 to 2 years. And people talk about babies in terms of months for the first 2 years. So a lot of times you ask somebody how old their baby is, and they'll say something like 16 months. And that's because babies change so quickly from month to month. There's a lot of difference from the baby that you see here, which is brand newborn. You can still see the umbilical cord. That's this thing is attached to them. That's where they get all their nutrition and things from the mother. And they're still covered in ooze, for lack of a better word. This baby, all they can do is eat, pee and poop, and cry and sleep. That's it. They are not, they can't see correctly. They can hear, and that's actually the very first test you take in your life is the startle test. As soon as you are born, they will do something to startle you, such as clap your hands, make a noise to see if you respond, if you can hear it, and jerk and start crying because that's what humans do. That's where you get in old cartoons, you see somebody smacking the baby on the bottom. That's to serves the same purpose. It's important for newborns to cry right away. It helps clear their passages and their airway of the mucus and things from inside mom. So, some physical characteristics during this time period. It is super rapid development. You go from being able to do pretty much nothing but the basics when you're born to being a 2-year-old that can walk and talk and communicate. You develop your large motor skills from laying there to first you hold your head up, then you roll over, then you start crawling, well, pushing up and crawling, then you start pulling yourself up, and eventually you're walking and running. Your fine motor skills go from nothing to being able to grasp things like holding a bottle or a toy to using simple tools like eating utensils like a spoon. And then your bodily control. When you are brand new, you're unable to control anything of your bodily functions. If you have to go, you just do it. That's what diapers are for. To the time you're 2, you have probably started potty training and you're starting to be able to have a little bit more control over where and when you not only poop and pee, but also when you eat, you're able to wait instead of, just going to cry until you get fed. You understand, wait a minute, or not. Psychological characteristics, you have very rapid intellectual development. You're learning to associate senses with experiences. You're learning how to respond to other people. You recognize voices. You begin solving problems. That's a big part of solving problems is the game Peekaboo. Everybody has played Peekaboo sometime in your life, and babies really like that game, but it's also a way of teaching them about space and time and the fact that if you aren't looking at something, it still exists. Because infants and babies, if they can't see it, it they don't think it is still around. That's one of the reasons they get so upset when their caregiver leaves the room because it's like, oh no, they don't exist anymore. But they gradually come to this understanding. Social characteristics. You are totally dependent on primary caregivers. You have to have somebody taking care of you at this age, otherwise, you will not survive. It's important to have your caregivers because that's who you bond with and associate with. For most children, it's mom and dad. As soon as you're born, mom holds you and dad holds you, and that instantly establishes a bond with the child. It's not just a psychological bond, it also has to do with things like body temperature and smell. Mothers can pick out their own infant by the way they smell, and babies can pick out their mom by the way they smell. And you are beginning to communicate from just making noises to making noises that have a meaning, even if it's just seemingly babbling, to beginning how to talk. So, care of infants. Healthcare and nutrition is critical in order to have a healthy baby. That includes regular checkups, regular testing by the doctor to make sure that everything is working right, vaccinations, and monitoring of growth. Vaccinations are important. All of you have vaccination records that follow you around for the entire rest of your life, and it's a lot easier now that we have digital things. Back in my day, we had paper cards that we had to keep up with because if you didn't have your record, you couldn't go to school, you couldn't get a job, etc. And if you lost it, you also had to get all your shots over, which is no fun. Nutrition is important as the baby moves from a milk and formula diet to a solid food diet. You gradually, about the age of 6, 7 months, start introducing soft foods like cereals and baby foods, and then you build up until by the time they're 2, they're, scarfing up spaghetti and Cheerios. Now, this is the sad part. We also need to talk here about mortality rate. Babies are hands down the most fragile human there is. Even very, very elderly people, they're kind of fragile, but not as much as babies. And mortality rate of infants is the amount of babies that die before they are 2 years old. And it's important because it impacts the overall population. And over on the right, you see Angel Gown, which is a service that provides burial clothes for very young children. So this is a kind of current infant mortality rate. The data is a little bit old, um, and it's certainly changed a bit with COVID, even though COVID doesn't seem to be quite as serious for younger children, but it is serious for mothers. And a lot of mothers, a good amount of them that had COVID and then went into labor, one or the other didn't make it. And that was due to oxygen levels. But we are looking at the overall infant mortality. So this is death out of 100 or 1,000. And you can see that more babies survive in Finland, Japan, Portugal, Sweden, and just read your way down the list. We have European countries, we have Asian countries, Middle Eastern countries, Australia's in there, and then New Zealand's in there, and then all the way down here we have the United States, which the highest infant mortality rate. And even though we have programs like WIC, which is Women, Infants, Children, which is a way to guarantee nutrition for the mother and the child, um, unfortunately in our country we do not have a healthcare program that provides more than just the really rough basics for free. So other countries like Finland and Japan, they have healthcare programs where you are totally taken care of, and then you also have an extensive leave for both the mother and the father after the baby is born. And all of that is very important. But now we're going to travel back in time. And we're going to before 1900, so about 121 years ago, and a little bit before that. And so before that, the mortality rate in the United States for infants was 30%. And what that means is more than approximately three babies would die. Well, I said that wrong. One in three babies would die. So for every three kids that were born, only two would make it past the age of 3. And we're going to look at some reasons why. And you might end up being a little bit surprised. Because, first of all, think about these three ethnic groups that were prevalent in the United States at the time. We have Anglo Americans, also known as white people. Um, they are more correctly referred to Anglo Americans at this time period because they were directly, within a generation of two from immigrating. We have Native Americans and we have African Americans. So which one had healthiest babies? It is the African Americans. Their babies were the healthiest and had the best chance of surviving. And that was due to matrilineal culture, which means that the women kind of take charge totally of how the children are raised. They used a lot of traditional medicine, folk medicine. They had midwives, which are women that deliver babies, and the women cared for children as a group. Even during times of slavery, if a mother and child were separated, whether they were sold or unfortunately, a lot of times, African American women who had a baby would be taken away to nurse a white person's baby and not their own. But other women in their community would step up and take care of the child as if it was their own. So the children were always put first and cared for first. Post emancipation, families lived in extended units. The adults would share the child care. So instead of having a child in charge of children, adult female would be in charge of the children. And that's an important part of survival too. Native Americans had a medium rate of survival, which was mainly due to genocide. Genocide against Native Americans at the time included disease. They didn't have resistance to a lot of the European diseases. It was also due to relocation from their environments that were their homes to harsh environments. Think about the Trail of Tears and the Cherokees walking from the North Carolina mountains to Oklahoma. Very, very different environments. And starvation and war. Native Americans at this time period and always worked hard to protect their children so that their nation and their culture would survive. That kind of survival instinct kicks in across the board whenever there is some sort of risk to the culture and people start protecting their children more and having more children to compensate for the rising death count. The overall population of Native Americans declined rapidly during this time period due to an overall higher death rate and lower birth rate, which was a direct result of genocide practices. And what you're looking at there is a Native American mother and her infant, and the thing behind the infant is a cradle board. And this was literally a board, and you see how it's kind of tied around the baby. It was sort of like a baby backpack, and the mother would wear her baby on her back whenever they traveled, whenever she was doing stuff. So the baby was not, set down on the ground ever. Um, White people also used something similar to a cradle board, but it had a loop or hook on the back, and instead of wearing it, they would literally hang the baby on the hook on the wall, and the baby would be there and not be on the ground. You wouldn't want your baby on the ground because it's not sanitary, it's cold, and there's animals. Anglo Americans, though, had a very high death rate. This is the 1 in 3. And there are three main reasons why. And first of all, you're looking at a photo over there, and these are more common than you think. This is a family photo that shows a family. They have three children and two deceased twins. Um, Photography was relatively new, and it was seen as a way to memorialize uh, dead people, especially children, and it was very common to take photos of your dead children. So anyway, why they had the high rate? For one thing, hospitals. Hospitals were new. They had hospitals before, but they were geared more towards treating men and treating things like wounds. But for the first time, instead of women being cared for by a midwife when they were having children, women were attended by a male doctor. And if you had a male doctor at that time period, men male doctors could not look at their female patients. I mean, they could look at her face and things, but they could not see her body unclothed. So she would have a blanket totally covering her, and he would be reaching underneath that blanket blindly trying to deliver the baby. And also, and this seems so simple because right now, especially, we know it's so important. They did not know about washing hands. They would just wipe their hands on a towel, but in the meantime, they would go to patient without washing. So the doctor might have treated an accident victim and then gone to somebody who was sick with something like cholera or dysentery or yellow fever, and then maybe have done a dissection as teaching medical students, because that's how they taught you, and then gone and delivered the baby. And they've never washed their hands with soap and water, they just wiped it on a towel to get whatever off, and they're carrying all those germs and infections. And that brings us right to disease, because the majority of Anglo Americans at this time lived in cities and urban areas. And those areas did not have things, and even the rural areas did not have things that we take for granted, like indoor plumbing. So water sources for cities stayed contaminated, and they were a major source of diseases such as cholera, yellow fever, and dysentery. And all of those could be lethal to babies. So even if you had your baby at home, which a lot of people still did, um, there was still a high chance of them getting sick with the disease. So to kind of show you what one of the issues were, over on the right there, you have a chamber pot, and this would have been a chamber pot for kind of an upper class home. If you were a lower class, you wouldn't have the chair or the box, you just have the container. And this is how you use the bathroom. You sat on the chair like it was a toilet. You can see there's a hole in it. And then the pot would catch, urine and feces, pee and poop. And then you would put the lid on it and put it in the wooden box, and that helped a little tiny bit with the smell and not spilling it everywhere. And when it was full, you took it and you dumped it out your window onto the street. And you kind of aim for the gutter because between the street and the sidewalk there would be a gutter where all this yuck would go, and also all of the stuff from the street, because remember, no cars, so you have horses and oxen and all of their poop and pee running off too. This is also why women walked when a man is walking you down a street, the man stands on your left side and you stand on the right side. And that's because you are less likely to be hit by the contents of a chamber pot and ruin your clothes. It's just good manners. Yeah. Anyway, all of this would drain down, and they didn't have the water filtration systems the way we have now, and it would go right into the drinking water and cooking water and things of that nature. And then the third reason was fashion. Women wore corsets that constricted the waist and internal organs, including the baby. And at this time period, it was bad manners or immoral to be seen in public when showing that you were pregnant. And in order to work outside the home, if you did that, or to keep up a social life, or even like go shopping uh, to buy food, or to go to church, or any of those things, you would have to wear a tight corset so that you did not look pregnant. And what happens is this restricts the oxygen flow and the blood flow and other things and the baby itself, and this resulted in babies that were had lower birth weights, tended to be premature and not as healthy. So over here on the right we have this diagram that shows what happened with the internal organs. This is a cutaway of a normal woman's body showing her chest cavity with the rib cages, lungs, heart, and all your digestive system happily curled up. And then with the corset, you can see how it constricts. It pushes the rib cage down, which pushes the lungs down, which makes them not inflate as well. And then all of the organs are pushed down as too. And so all of that's putting a lot of pressure on the baby as well. This was pretty much a uniquely Anglo-American thing. Um, African Americans, unless they were basically forced to by being in house service or something, they did not wear corsets and they did not wear them nearly as tightly. And the Native Americans, of course, did not wear them. So these are just some examples. On the left here, you see a corset that is not laced. You can understand how it's structured. Where those lines are, that would be inserts of either whalebone or metal. And then those laces, you would put this on, and then somebody would help you, and they would pull those laces until the two sides meet. And here you have a photograph of a woman pulling her laces to make it small. This woman is very tightly laced. This was unusual. People didn't go this small, though the ideal for young women who were still courting, think Bridgerton, was to have a waist small enough that your dance partner could put his hands around your waist with his thumbs touching each other, and then with his middle fingers touching each other. So we're talking like 12-inch waists. And then over on the right, you see an ad for a maternity corset and how it holds the figure at all times in proper position. So, in other words, it holds you so that you are not showing that you are pregnant. Uh, this kind of corset training, it's not something that you just started when you were a teenager. It started with being a little girl. You learned how to wear these. And giving birth has changed as well. Before the advent of hospitals and things, midwives attended women. Midwives are usually older women in the community that have training in folk medicine, herbal medicine, plus have experience giving birth and attending births. They know how it works. Women did not lay down to give birth in the past. If you sit or you squat, gravity works with you instead of against you, and it helps the birth to be easier and less stressful on everybody. So we just talked about Japan, and in the top right image you see, and this is from the Edo period woodcut, of a woman who is sitting. She's sitting on her knees, and you can see she's pregnant. She has a woman behind her that supports her when she pushes, and then the midwife is on front. And then over here you have medieval Europe, and you have a woman that is sitting in a birthing chair. Remember that chamber pot? It looks kind of like that, except for the front is cut out as well. You have somebody behind her that is supporting her when she pushes, and then the midwife in front. Chairs were important because Europe was a much colder climate at the time, and on floors inside buildings, it was very common to use hay to cover the floor, not carpet or things like that, or to have a bare floor. But hay was used for insulation, and a lot of times homes were attached to barns, and other animals would kind of be around wandering in and out. So you definitely wanted to avoid that floor. But then, with the doctors in the hospitals where the doctors were not allowed to look at the women were placed laying down on their backs. And that was to protect their modesty. It made it a lot more difficult because gravity is pulling the baby down towards the small of your back instead of out. But this stayed the main position until after 1980. That's a long time. It started changing in the 70s, and then they developed, there's various ways that you can give birth now. One of the more popular is a birthing chair, which can be adjusted. It has these kind of padded things that you can use to hold on to help you when you're pushing. And then you have, it's cut out like the medieval birthing chairs, and there is a little container to catch everything that comes out with the baby, because everything comes out with the baby. Yeah. So, your assignment, modern methods. You can use your Chromebook, of course, and you might want to talk to a relative if possible, a mom or an aunt or a grandmother, even an older sibling, and try to find out these answers to these questions. First of all, where were you born? Not so much the location, like a city or whatever, but were you born in a hospital? Were you born at home? Were you born in a car or something on the way to a hospital? Were you born in an elevator? I know during Hurricane Flo, they had babies being born at the Family Dollar parking lot, which was right across from my house in Burgaw. And that's going to be an interesting story. One of our former teachers here had her baby in the elevator between the lobby and the maternity ward of New Hanover Hospital. Couldn't wait just to get upstairs. You know, there's lots of different places. Next question, who was there? Sometimes it's just the mother. Sometimes the mother, when she's giving birth, the father might join her, or her mother, or her sisters, your aunts, older siblings, whoever. For a while in the 1980s, it was a trend when VCRs and VCR recorders were created to have everybody there when you're giving birth, your whole family, you know, extra kids, dad, everybody, and dad's filming the whole thing that you then show to other people, and people don't really want to see that. Or like me, when I was having my son in the hospital, there was a team of student nurses that was observing. Okay. Anyway, so who is there? Number three, why do people have baby showers? So think about that. And you could kind of count gender reveals in with this, but there's some purposes for it. If you don't know what a baby shower is, it's a party that is given for the mother before the baby is born. And that leads into number four, how do we announce and celebrate births? This has changed over the years. especially with the technology and social media. But some people still do things outside their house to show that there's a new baby there. And the fifth thing, do you know where your birth certificate is? That's a very important piece of paper for you to keep track of for the rest of your life. And do you have anything given to you when you were born? If you don't know the answer to some of these questions, and you may not, um, then that's okay. But I do would like for you to try to find out because the more you know about yourself, the better things are. And then over on the right here is an example of something given to you when you were born. It was very popular in the 1950s and 60s was to get your first pair of shoes bronzed for a keepsake. That means that you would send your baby shoes off to a company and they would dip them into liquid metal and you would end up with a metal baby shoe. Your grandparents or somebody might still have those around or your great grandparents. Okay, that's it.